Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Okay, let's unpack this. Today on the Deep Dive, we're looking at a really complex and rapidly evolving situation. The potential for a territorial compromise in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah, it's certainly moving fast. Our information today, well, it pulls from a variety of observations. We're seeing things play out on the ground, definitely, but also observing significant geopolitical maneuvering and, crucially, the unpredictable nature of some key international players.
Right. So our mission today is to take all these different pieces, really try to distill them down to what matters most and help you, the listener, understand the driving forces and what possible outcomes we might be looking at all without getting sort of lost in the constant information churn.
The central question that keeps coming up, and rightly so, is whether a territorial compromise in this war is even a realistic possibility at this point.
Exactly. And to get a snapshot of current thinking, there's this initial poll question posed. Is a territorial compromise inevitable? Is it maybe possible, but not something either side has to do? Will neither side give an inch? Or, are concessions actually on the table? It really frames the whole spectrum, doesn't it?
It does. And what's interesting here is that much of the current discussion, whether it's happening officially or, through various back channels, seems to revolve around these very ideas of potential compromises.
Now, we're seeing some quite different perspectives on where this war might be headed. One view suggests we could see a relatively swift resolution, maybe within the next year, possibly due to a potential Ukrainian capitulation.
And the reasoning behind that view points to pretty significant challenges for Ukraine. Lack of funds, really severe infrastructure damage, and, critically, supplies of air defense missiles running low.
And there are also concerning reports about negative trends in their conscription efforts, right?
That's part of the picture, yes. It paints a pretty grim scenario for Ukraine's ability to sustain the fight long term, according to that perspective.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, this idea of a swift resolution, well, it contrasts sharply with the ongoing reality on the ground, doesn't it? It's still very much a conflict in progress.
Absolutely. And it's also worth noting that there's apparently a meeting between someone named Witkoff and Putin scheduled for tomorrow. So that suggests that diplomatic channels, however uncertain they might be, are still active.
And then you've got this whole layer of what's being called white noise surrounding potential peace plans. There's just a lot of skepticism out there, particularly around any plan that gets attributed to Trump.
Yeah, it's almost a question of whether a concrete plan even exists, And if it does, what are the specific details? No one seems to have a really clear picture.
It does raise an important question about the reliability of the information we're getting. We see these conflicting messages, the Kremlin sometimes hinting at negotiations, but then at other times, like through statements from Peskov, completely dismissing any concessions beyond their already stated objectives.
Exactly. And then you have Witkoff apparently suggesting a compromise based on the current front lines. It just adds another layer to this white noise.
Right. Trying to make sense of any of it feels incredibly challenging right now. And a lot of this uncertainty seems to stem from Trump and his team. There's this sense that they might not actually have a cohesive or well-defined strategy at all.
Well, what's noteworthy there is the negative portrayal you sometimes see of Trump's team as disorganized and lacking that clear strategy.
Yeah.
And this is kind of underscored by the fact that despite these apparent internal inconsistencies, there's also talk of a significant increase in the defense budget. It makes you wonder about the logic, doesn't it?
It really does. And Trump himself is just so unpredictable in his statements and actions. I mean, what he might say on a Tuesday morning could completely contradict what he asserted just the Monday evening before.
Yeah. It just creates this environment of uncertainty. And it makes you question how any meaningful, stable negotiations could even take place under those circumstances.
Okay, so shifting slightly, you mentioned the Iran nuclear negotiations are sometimes brought up as a parallel, maybe.
Yes, exactly. They're often cited as a prime example of how unreliable and, frankly, subject to shifts these kinds of international talks can be.
Right. Reportedly, the Iranian foreign minister held multiple meetings in Moscow and Beijing, both before and after some of these nuclear talks, which really illustrates how other global powers are, deeply engaged in being consulted.
And what's interesting there is this stark contrast between, say, Witkoff's initial, more optimistic statements about Iran pursuing a peaceful nuclear program, and then the subsequent denials of that very idea. It just highlights a significant lack of accountability sometimes in these international negotiations. Statements can be made and then, well, walked back.
Yeah, it really underscores that point, doesn't it? In these high-stakes situations, statements can be made and then completely reversed without any real repercussions.
Yeah.
So all this talk of potential peace plans and compromises in Ukraine, it starts to feel equally uncertain, potentially unreliable.
So shifting our focus back to the different stances on ending the war itself, one perspective is that the solution is, well, quite straightforward. One side simply needs to acknowledge defeat and withdraw.
Simple, but obviously not easy. And the immediate total defeat of Ukraine is seen as undesirable by many in the international community, right?
Correct. And that naturally leads to the current sort of stalemate, doesn't it? The side that's perceived to be in a winning position, which currently appears to be Russia, doesn't seem to have a compelling incentive to make significant concessions at this moment.
What about Zelensky's position? I think you mentioned something he said in South Africa.
Yes, that's noteworthy. He reportedly mentioned that even considering negotiations with a full ceasefire already in place would represent a significant compromise for Ukraine.
Wow. Okay. So that gives a glimpse into at least one perspective on what a compromise might even look like from their side. Just getting to the table with guns silent is a concession.
Precisely. But then we have to ask why unconditional negotiations, the idea of just stopping the fighting and then trying to talk terms, why doesn't that seem to be gaining much traction?
It's possible that even figures like Trump might not support that approach. Is that the thinking?
That's one line of thought. And this raises an important question about potential pre-existing agreements or understandings. The cancellation of Witkoff's planned trip to London, especially while his trip to Moscow seems to still be on. Well, it could suggest that certain agreements or frameworks are already being discussed, or maybe are even in place with the Kremlin.
Interesting point. And the prevailing thought seems to be that Russia might just believe it has a genuine opportunity for a complete victory if it simply keeps up the current military pressure.
From their perspective, why negotiate and make concessions if they think they can ultimately achieve all their objectives through continued military effort? It's a grim calculation.
Looking at how the conflict itself has changed, it's been noted that what started as a special military operation has now, well, clearly transitioned into a full-scale war.
Yes, and that shift was reportedly triggered by Ukrainian actions in the Kursk region specifically.
And while the tragic civilian casualties in Kyiv are acknowledged, there's also this attempt to contextualize them by drawing comparisons to civilian deaths in other conflicts involving, say, Israel or the U.S., like in Yemen.
It's a stark and deeply unsettling comparison to make, but it is part of the discourse surrounding the conflict.
If we connect this to the broader trajectory, there's been a clear shift in targeting, hasn't there? Towards energy infrastructure, profit-generating enterprises.
Yeah. Yes, and what has been described by some sources as a total cleansing of certain territories. This suggests a significant escalation in both the objectives and the methods being used.
Which then leads back to those serious questions about Ukraine's long-term capacity to keep fighting. Concerns about personnel shortages, more losses than recruits.
That's the report, yes. And worries about dwindling supplies of essential weapons and, crucially, those air defense missiles we talked about.
Now, what's interesting is the acknowledgement of potential future financial aid for Ukraine. But the emphasis seems to be on the current lack of readily available weapons.
Exactly. And this shortage is reportedly linked to existing U.S. commitments in other strategically important regions, particularly the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific. The weapons just aren't there in the quantities needed right now, apparently.
So from one perspective, it would seem like the rational thing for a leader in Ukraine's position would be to actively push for negotiations, right? To try and preserve what's left.
That's one viewpoint, yes, the rational actor model. However, this contrasts with another perspective that portrays Zelensky as more of a, perhaps, symbolic figurehead.
With actual control residing elsewhere, like the UK and Europe.
That's the argument, that these external actors require a continuing perception of a powerful enemy and this unifying idea to justify their ongoing financial and military support. They need the narrative.
And that brings us to this concept of the great enemy narrative itself. The argument is that portraying Russia as this formidable enemy is a key part of military propaganda within Ukraine.
Yes, and furthermore, Ukraine's heavy reliance on foreign arms and money leads to the view, in some analyses, that it's essentially become a tool used by other nations to advance their own geopolitical goals.
Okay, turning to the financial side for a moment. There was a Financial Times report about Ukraine's GDP-linked debt warrants.
Yes, apparently Ukraine is now facing a substantial payment obligation linked to those warrants, something their Ministry of Finance reportedly hadn't fully anticipated.
But there's a counter-argument there, isn't there? About GDP itself being manipulable.
There is. It's important to remember that GDP is ultimately a statistical measure. Especially in a war situation, it can be subject to various forms of manipulation or just not accurately reflect the real economic health. So how reliable that specific metric is questionable.
But it definitely underscores the significant financial pressures Ukraine is under. And this leads naturally to the question: what are the underlying strategic goals of external actors like the UK and Europe in all this?
Well, one theory suggests their primary goals involve stimulating their own domestic economies through military spending, although how much actually goes to real production is debated.
Right.
And the other big goal is seen as fostering unity among their populations against a common enemy, this terrible Russian bear narrative, as a way to maintain political control at home.
The idea being that previous unifying themes, maybe climate change or the pandemic, have lost some punch.
Exactly, that they might have lost some effectiveness in galvanizing public opinion, leaving the perceived Russian threat as the main external focus for maintaining internal cohesion.
But that raises a crucial question about how long that narrative can last, doesn't it? Especially for European populations facing their own serious domestic economic problems while seeing huge amounts of aid going to Ukraine.
It's a very real tension, and you see things like Germany's civil defense preparations, which some describe as seemingly inadequate, highlighting this potential disconnect.
And there's also the ongoing issue of the dehumanization of Russia in a lot of Western media, and the apparent inconsistencies in applying moral standards, like continuing to buy Russian energy.
Very similar patterns emerge when you look at U.S. involvement. Contradictions, perceived double standards.
Like the stated concern for Ukrainian lives, contrasted with actions or inactions in places like Gaza.
Precisely that kind of comparison is often made. And there's a reference to Zelensky's interview with Ben Shapiro, where Ukraine is positioned as this strategically vital partner against Russia.
Right, I remember that. Zelensky apparently thanked Trump for pursuing peace before, but also firmly denied Ukraine started the war, and emphasized this idea of a long-standing Russian desire to destroy the U.S.
Yes, that was the message conveyed. And what's noteworthy here is the publicly stated goal of both the U.S. and some European nations: inflict maximum damage on Russia, maybe even bring about regime change.
But the criticism is that these same strategies keep being used despite, well, a lack of clear success so far.
Correct. Which leads to significant uncertainty about a potential shift in U.S. policy, including the possibility of withdrawal, even if official statements suggest otherwise.
There's one perspective that certain globalist elements in Europe hope to frame this as Trump's war, right? Something he's resisted.
That's one interpretation, yes. And a potential U.S. withdrawal gets compared to Biden's Afghanistan withdrawal, suggesting Trump might just disengage if he feels no satisfactory deal is possible.
And the argument is that continuing to prolong the conflict only pushes Russia and China closer together.
Exactly. Which brings us to the erosion of that long-standing U.S. geopolitical strategy, the Nixon-Kissinger idea of keeping better relations with both Moscow and Beijing than they had with each other.
That strategy seems, well, abandoned now.
The criticism is that it has been abandoned, yes, and that the primary beneficiary is China. China's secured this vital land route for energy from Russia and Central Asia, making potential U.S. naval blockades much less effective.
Plus, the Iran-China alliance is strengthening, with China heavily reliant on Iranian oil.
Demonstrably strengthening. It creates a shared interest in seeing U.S. Middle East policy fail. And this idea of a north-south transport corridor through Iran could further bypass traditional sea routes, undermining U.S. influence.
Okay, shifting gears dramatically, there are alarming reports of escalating tensions between India and Pakistan. Nuclear powers.
Yes, very concerning developments. Reports of an alleged terrorist attack, Pakistan denying involvement, leading to diplomatic expulsions.
And unconfirmed reports of Pakistani military mobilization. Strong rhetoric.
All of that, yes. And underlying this immediate tension is the critical, long-standing issue of water access to the Indus River, which India could potentially control.
Is the theory that this could be an Indian provocation? Maybe linked to internal politics?
That theory is being put forward, yes. possibly linked to internal issues, a desire for national unity. And it's worth remembering this region lacks major oil and gas, so the drivers are likely geopolitical and specifically water resources.
Okay, bringing it back to Witkoff. His continued travel to Moscow, despite canceling London, seems significant. It suggests direct talks with Moscow are still a priority, right?
It certainly appears that way. And adding another piece to the puzzle is that Bloomberg report detailing aspects of a potential Trump peace plan for Ukraine.
Right. What were the key points there? Something about no restrictions on the Ukrainian army.
Yes, reportedly no restrictions on the Ukrainian army or defense industry, which would be a major shift from demands for demilitarization.
And the Zaporizhia nuclear plant.
The plan apparently involves Russia returning control of the plant to Ukraine, but with the crucial stipulation that the plant would then come under U.S. control for energy supply to both sides.
U.S. control. I thought Zelensky had previously rejected that idea.
He has, publicly. The plan also reportedly includes Ukrainian access through the Dnieper River in that zone. So this Bloomberg report could be offering insights, maybe guidance, or context for Witkoff's talks in Moscow.
But what's striking is how different this reported Trump plan sounds from the Kremlin's stated aims and from what Peskov has been saying recently.
Exactly. There's a significant divergence. It raises serious questions about how Russian state media would even try to explain a compromise that deviates so much from their narrative of achieving all objectives.
And there was that mention of a past conversation between Putin and Trump, where Trump supposedly advised against hitting infrastructure, which clearly hasn't happened.
Right. It contrasts sharply with the ongoing destruction. Now, while the Russian public might ultimately accept almost any outcome via propaganda, a perceived squandering of a near victory could definitely create problems down the line, maybe even lead to future conflict.
So the fact this detailed, different Trump plan got leaked, it strongly suggests something is happening behind the scenes, right? Some negotiation or shift.
It's hard to imagine such a specific proposal being leaked without some basis. In reality, yes, it implies movement.
And what about Crimea on this? Still ambiguous.
Still ambiguous. Reports suggesting the U.S. might be tacitly starting to recognize it as Russian, despite Ukraine's firm rejection.
But Trump himself previously said he'd never recognize the annexation.
Correct. Another layer of complexity and, frankly, contradiction.
So one possible U.S. strategy behind leaking this plan. Could it be setting terms designed for Zelensky to reject?
That's one theory. That it allows the U.S. to blame Ukraine for talks failing, reduce aid, accept what's mandated by Congress, and then withdraw, leaving the issue more to Europe while the U.S. focuses elsewhere, maybe even business with Russia.
It all just underscores this potential breakdown in traditional foreign policy making, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Compared to past administrations where experts developed plans, vetted them.
Exactly. The current approach seems much more fluid, perhaps erratic. The inconsistencies in statements from different officials, the president's shifting views, it suggests less of a clear, unified plan.
Okay, and just as we're processing all this, breaking news regarding India and Pakistan. India has actually blocked the Indus River flow.
Yes, reports are coming in now stating India has officially blocked the flow, closing the controlling sluice gates. Pakistan had explicitly warned this would be considered an act of war.
Wow. That is extremely serious, potentially bringing them right to the brink.
It's incredibly serious. While it could just be immense pressure from India, given the history and the nuclear dimension, this is a deeply concerning escalation.
Okay, let's pivot back to economics briefly. The economists cover With the Wounded Eagle, counting down Trump's term, and Trump 2028 merchandise already appearing.
Yes, both indicative of the political climate. And we're also seeing a fairly quick backtracking on some tariff policies.
Didn't the original tariff idea come from a hedge fund manager linked to that 2025 strategy think tank?
It reportedly originated in a white paper from that circle, yes. Though it's often noted their original proposals were perhaps more moderate or conventionally reasoned than the policies ultimately implemented.
And China's response to the tariffs, willing to negotiate removal on both sides.
That's been their public stance, yes. And there's this broader view that China, realizing it couldn't just rely on domestic demand, strategically pivoted to dominating global manufacturing.
But the concern is that this dominance is hurting other countries' industrial bases and consumer demand, affecting their value-added sectors.
That's the worry, yes. That the globalization trend, the international division of labor, has stalled or reversed in the last decade. You can see it in trade volumes. And some analysts argue China's current path might even harm itself long-term.
Okay, very latest from Trump on Ukraine. Meeting the Norwegian leader facing journalists.
Yes, and amid some interesting side notes about Kremlin trolls and propagandist accusations,
Right.
Trump stated the next few days would be critical for Ukraine negotiations. He emphasized compromise means mutual concessions.
And crucially, he defined Russia's concession as what exactly?
Stopping the war and not seizing all of Ukraine. That was his specific framing of Russia's potential concession.
Stopping the war and not taking all of Ukraine. That seems, well, it aligns with the view that Ukraine might be nearing capitulation, doesn't it?
Right.
As if Russia could take all of it, but might agree not to.
It could be interpreted that way, perhaps a moment of clarity aligning with that grim assessment, though whether it's a coordinated message is anyone's guess.
Probably not coordinated. Still, it raises the fundamental question, why would Russia want all of Ukraine anyway? The resources required, what to do with it? Further expansion seems unlikely, right?
Highly unlikely. The key strategic objectives for Russia seem more focused: securing Odessa and Mykolaiv, preventing a British Black Sea presence, controlling territories east of the Dnipro.
Because the rest of Ukraine is already heavily under U.S. influence.
Largely, yes. You can draw a parallel with Lukashenko and Belarus tried balancing, now heavily reliant on Moscow. And the sanctions war has pushed Russia and China closer, giving Russia more leverage in that partnership.
So when the U.S. says it might withdraw from negotiations, what does that actually mean?
It's ambiguous, isn't it? Could mean blaming Zelensky and cutting aid, or just stopping active talks but maintaining current support levels.
And most U.S. aid has been via presidential decrees, so it could be revoked. No big new packages lately?
Correct on both counts. No major new packages announced recently.
And Trump's evolving rhetoric, saying he doesn't believe Russia is an obstacle to peace now?
Yes, and claiming Russia has offered to stop the war and not take all of Ukraine, suggesting a deal is close, maybe within 2 weeks. Journalists noted the May 10th date connection.
So his most likely strategy to save face seems to be blaming Ukraine, or the globalists, for being unwilling to negotiate terms he deems acceptable.
That appears to be a plausible path. Claim he did everything possible, then pivot to economic cooperation with Russia.
Because ultimately, Trump is a product of the U.S. system that initially aimed to weaken both Russia and China.
That's one way to view it. Whether the U.S. will actually withdraw, like from Afghanistan, it's an open question, though arguably rational from a certain strategic perspective.
Leaving a potential future Ukraine partitioned. Western parts to Poland-Hungary, the central state, eastern territories, plus Odessa-Mykolaiv to Russia.
That's one potential scenario being discussed. Yes, a fractured outcome.
Which leaves huge unanswered questions, like who bears Ukraine's debt in that scenario?
A very significant question. And could Ukrainian politicians then see a third war as the only way to resolve things eventually?
Wow. Okay. Today's deep dive into this incredibly tangled situation around the Russia-Ukraine war and all the related global events, it really reveals a complex web. Shifting alliances, conflicting goals, deeply uncertain outcomes.
Absolutely. From the potential, however fraught, for territorial compromise in Ukraine to those truly alarming escalations in South Asia and the constantly shifting strategies of the major powers. The information landscape is dense. It requires really careful examination.
We sincerely hope this exploration has provided you, the listener, with some valuable insights, maybe a clear understanding of the key factors currently at play in these critical global dynamics.
But as always, this is really just the beginning of the conversation, isn't it? We strongly encourage you to keep exploring these complex topics, seek out different perspectives, different analyses, and form your own informed conclusions.
Yeah. Definitely. What key points stood out to you from this deep dive? What important questions are still rattling around in your mind? And what connections do you see between these events and other things happening around the world?
Keep asking those questions.
Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive. Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. New episodes every day.